today I'm going to be doing the year in review book tag in a cozier setting for Christmas. This is the perfect time of year to take some time to reflect on all the wonderful books we've read, some wonderful book memories we've made, and learn what worked for us and what didn't. So I love this tag for this reason, and I'm very glad to be doing it. This was created by Dominish Books, a fantastic booktuber. I will link his original tag in the description. I was kindly tagged by RJ Gibson, another wonderful channel, and from Nico's Book Reviews. I will link, of course, all three videos in the description. Very excited to get into this. And the first question is the hardest, and that is my favorite book of the year. And as I am reading this, I am a good ways into The Crippled God by Steven Erikson. And I don't know if this will for sure be my favorite book of the year, but I'm going to bet it will be because I'm loving it so much. I've been so emotional over my experience reading it so far. It has already made me cry a few times. It has already taken my breath away. It has just been mesmerizing. I've been really enjoying my time reading it. And I've needed to hold back and slow down a little bit so I can really make sure that I'm absorbing everything in this book. But I love it. I am loving it so much. I'm so excited to get to the end of it. I'm hoping that will happen before the end of the year. And I'm hoping I can say with true honesty that this will be my favorite book of the year. But that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm betting on. Question number 2 is my favorite series I started but haven't finished. Now, I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer to this question because I can't think of any series this year that I started that I haven't finished that is a finished series, if that makes sense. So I finished a few series or a few trilogies and things like that this year, but those were all things I started last year. And of course, they don't count for this question because it's a series that I haven't finished. And then there are a few series that I'm in the middle of, but one, either I started those before this year, like Malazan Book of the Fallen and the Dark Tower series, or those books or those series aren't finished yet. So I started, for example, Rebecca Roanhorse's new series, starting with Black Sun earlier this year. The next book comes out next year, so I don't think that counts. And then I started the Red Rising series this year, and I do need to catch up with the last book, Dark Age, but there is still another book yet to come out for that series. So I don't know if that counts either. So I don't really have a good answer for this question. Number 3, favorite new author you discovered this year? And I actually have a couple of answers for this. One is Susanna Clarke, because I loved reading Piranesi. I've already talked about it so much on this channel that I probably shouldn't talk about it again, but it's a short standalone, Piranesi, fantastic book, beautiful prose, beautiful character, and it just really tugged at my heartstrings. And I read this with my mom, and I have a wonderful video with her here on the channel. So that is definitely an author that was new to me. And I understand she's coming out with a new book next year, so I would really love to read another book by her. And then another author who comes to mind is Stephen Graham Jones, because I read The Only Good Indians this year. And as soon as I finished that book, I immediately wanted to pick up My Heart is a Chainsaw. I didn't, but it made me think about it because I really enjoyed that book as well. And I can easily see myself wanting to read more books by that author too. And both of those books were so unique. They were both standalones. And with both books, they made me want to find other books like those books that are unique in that way, if that makes sense. So I think that those two authors definitely left an impression on me enough that I want to continue reading both their books, but also books like their books. Number 4 is my favorite reread, and for this, I think I'm going to have to go with The Lord of the Rings. Now, I had never finished The Lord of the Rings before this year. I had read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers before, but this is the year that I actually finished all 3 of the Lord of the Rings books. I finished The Return of the King, and it was so special for me, so special. And I think that those are books that are the standalone Lord of the Rings, if you want to consider it that way, is something that you can really love and appreciate at any time in life. It's always worth a reread, so definitely had a beautiful experience with that. And then next is my biggest surprise, and I do have a couple of answers for this. I already mentioned The Only Good Indians. That was quite a surprise for me because it was a horror book, and it was also an audiobook. and I really enjoyed it. I knew I would enjoy it actually, but I really enjoyed it. But the other one that came as a big surprise for me is The Child Thief by Brahm. I've mentioned this book a couple of times. I listened to the audiobook while I was moving, and at first I wasn't sure if this would be an author or book for me, but as I got into it, I was really swept away by the story. I really enjoyed actually some of the world building elements and some of the spin on Peter Pan characters. It was a really great imaginative horror retelling of Peter Pan with many fantasy elements. Well, Peter Pan is kind of a fantasy, but it really worked well for horror fantasy, and it made me realize that one, Brahm is another author I think I really want to read more of. And two, I think that I could actually get into the horror fantasy genre. It was a big surprise for me, so I have to go with that answer. And then next is the biggest disappointment. And I hate this question. I hate talking about books that made me disappointed because I always feel like it's my fault if I don't like a book. I know that's not always the case, but I really struggled. There are a few that come to mind, but I'm going to go with The Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. And I know that this is a very, very loved fantasy series. It's the first book in the Dragonlance Chronicles. And I could see why people enjoyed it. I think those who reread the book this year and who had read it when they were younger could agree that it didn't age very well. And there were just certain things that, I don't know, that just didn't quite work for me. I didn't feel quite immersed. I understand it had a huge influence on the genre and on many people who read fantasy today and many authors that I probably love, but I just didn't care for it at all. And I will not be continuing with the Dragonlance Chronicles as far as I can tell. And then next is the one book I'd recommend to anyone. And this might be a little bit of a surprise, but I don't really recommend any of the books I love to anyone, not even Malazan Book of the Fallen, not even Piranesi. I did a whole video about books that I love that I don't recommend to everyone, because for every book I love, I can always think of somebody I know who wouldn't love it. And so I'm very careful about how I recommend books. I'm always careful to know my audience or know the person's taste. And I try to be as thorough as possible in explaining what doesn't work for me and why it doesn't work for me, so that people can have an accurate idea of whether they should read the book, even if I loved it or even if I didn't. But I think that the book that I'm going to go for with this answer is actually not a book, but an essay, and that's On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. And even if you are not a fantasy reader, I think that you could get something out of this essay. I thought it was incredible. I just recently did a video on series versus standalones and whether we in Fantasy Booktube are crazy in our love of series and our talk of series, and why fantasy works better in a series format versus a standalone format. But after finishing that video, I started thinking back on that essay, and I started realizing there were probably a lot of things in that essay I could have tied into that video, because Tolkien talks a lot about the importance of constructing a fantasy world and the elements that go into that, and really some very interesting, important points that I think fantasy readers would appreciate. So I think that's the answer that I would go with. I think it's well worth reading, especially if you've read The Lord of the Rings. You could read it without reading The Lord of the Rings, but if you read The Lord of the Rings, then it brings other things in The Lord of the Rings into perspective, especially with this talk of eucatastrophe. It's so fascinating. So I read that in preparation for my discussion with Philip Chase here on my channel on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Tolkien himself. And it was such a wonderful discussion. And I read it fairly quickly to prepare for that discussion, in all honesty, but it's an essay I still think about and that I would like to revisit at some point, because I really thought it had some wonderful things to offer us fantasy readers. And again, even people who are not fantasy readers, but who want to know a little bit more about fantasy as a genre, who might even have some misconceptions about fantasy, I cannot recommend that essay enough. Oh, and now I have to tag some people. This is always kind of the challenging part for me, because I always try my best to tag people who haven't been tagged yet. For this, I think I'm going to tag David Wiley and who has a fantastic channel. He's an author himself, a fantasy author. He just released his fantasy young adult book, ebook on Amazon, so definitely check that out. And then I'm going to tag Average Joe Reads. I love Average Joe Reads. I feel like he and I have very different tastes when it comes to books. I mean, there's some crossover in what we love, but we love different things or different aspects of books. For example, he does not care about themes. He doesn't care about deep meaning in books. He doesn't care about eloquent prose. He wants very straightforward, direct storytelling. And I really appreciate his authenticity. And I think he has a very strong, important voice in our community. And then lastly, I'm going to tag Anitha, and I really love Anitha's channel. She lives in India. She reads a lot of fantastic fantasy. She's reading The Lord of the Rings right now, so that would be fantastic to see her do this tag. She's also promoting The Long Price Quartet on her channel. She read that series recently and did a review of that. But all three of these channels are fantastic, as is, of course, RJ's and Nico's book reviews, who tagged me, and Dominish Books. Let me know your thoughts on any of the answers I shared down below. Let me know what your favorite book of the year is, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.